All right, so this week, I chose rationality as the topic, thinking about what we might want to talk about. Um, and what I want to do is come to the end where we can have a bit of a discussion about sort of what the difficulties are that we face in becoming rational and being rational people. Because we live in an age with a lot of conspiracy theories these days. I suppose it's not a huge surprise that the pandemic gave rise to these, although there were many of these beforehand. Um, of course, conspiracy theories aren't new. People have always subscribed to these kinds of things, but they get a new life with social media, the internet. They get a new life with people who are calculating and driving them to put wedges between us, to make us not trust the reality that we see. And people in power seem to be vulnerable to these in a big way as well. So I thought we needed to talk about rationality. Um, since George Bush created the Office for Faith-Based Initiatives, the word faith-based has become a compliment. And I don't really think it should be. It's always kind of bothered me to suggest that what you're doing isn't rationally based, it's faith-based. To grant that is really to miss something. It frames religion in a way that is misleading. There's a long history of reason-based religion. If we want to think about any of the great scientists through history, most of them started in churches, worked with churches. They were often monks. They were in those places and supported by those lines of inquiry. So it's not that religion has to be faith, and that's the only way to arrive at it. But of course, by framing it that way, using the frame faith-based, that is what we quickly start to think. People have faiths, one kind or another. It's not reason. Now, part of this is the history. That is, there's often somebody who is threatened or challenged by what science has discovered, which might change something, and wants to cling to what they had before, wants to attach themselves to it. There's always a faction. It's usually not the church or not the church. It's usually one faction within a church, one faction within a particular religion against another one, right? That they're advancing themselves in one way or another. Certainly with science in the West and Christianity, the idea of a fixed text that you had to subscribe to and reason-based beliefs were bound to come into contradiction sooner or later. Reason adapts, it changes. You get better reasons and more evidence, whereas a fixed text stays the same. Conclusions. Darwin, who's often by sort of people who subscribe to faith, is often raised up as the enemy of this sort of faith. But Darwin himself was a very religious person. He fully believed that the investigations that he began were going to confirm how he had been taught to think about the Bible, and was very distressed when that's not what he found and didn't know what to do with it. And you have plenty of other stories like that, of inquiry of researchers, of scientists who expected, right, to confirm what their religious beliefs were, what they thought their texts required of them. And there were contradictions. So yes, I'm not inclined to lean towards the term faith-based. I don't think it's helpful or necessarily a compliment. There can be a role, maybe, and I'll talk about that later, for things that aren't totally rational. But I don't think we should pride ourselves on structuring our institutions around something other than reason. However, when somebody says like they're rational and they do their own research, I often cringe, because sometimes those people are the worst, right? When they say, oh, I do my own research, you got to do your own research. Usually that's a sign that you're dealing with somebody who's into these conspiracy theories, right? Who's attracted by these kinds of conspiracy theories. I do my own research in those cases usually means I find my own YouTube videos and watch those. Very few people do their own research. And when they do, it's usually on a very narrow question in a very narrow area that they're able to work on. So if we take scientists now, right, on what they do their own research on, the tiny things that they study where they actually do the experiments themselves and they measure the result themselves and they try to interpret that data, that's not nearly the same thing as these people that you run into that say, oh, I'm rational. Often they're not. And those people give fuel to the psychologist's claim that humans are not all that rational. that we really aren't rational creatures. We're subject to a lot of irrational influences. The Dunning-Kruger effect, where people, the less they know about something, more expert they think they are. Priming and framing can shape the way we think things. So if people prime you to start thinking one way, then you tend to continue thinking that way. Our emotions often capture our attention. So if you get angry, you usually find things that feed that angry. If you get sad, you usually find things that feed being more sad. If you are in a good mood, fortunately, that can be resilient too. But none of those are necessarily rational. When we engage in reasoning, psychologists will tell us a lot of human reasoning is what we would call motivated reasoning. That is, they've already come to a conclusion. We already know what we want to think. We've already made a decision, and somebody says, well, why did you do that? And you're coming back with a rationale to try and fill that in. Like, I guess I was thinking this. I don't know. Although people are rarely that honest, right? They come up with these after the fact reasons. So psychologists are right. I think a lot of us aren't rational most of the time. Iris Murdoch, I think, frames the issue best when she says, by opening our eyes, we do not necessarily see what confronts us. We are anxiety-ridden animals. Our minds are continually active, fabricating an anxious, usually self-preoccupied, often falsifying veil, which partially conceals the world. It is a task to come to see the world as it is. So I like what she does there, right? She identifies that we are anxiety-ridden animals, that our emotions, particularly our anxiety, can drive us in that way, that our minds then are active. They're not passive. They're not mirrors just sucking up what comes from the outside, but they're actively fabricating based on that anxious, usually self-preoccupied feel. And that partially conceals what's actually going on. We take ourselves to be more of the center of things than we really are. We take our fears usually to be bigger than they really are. And our reasoning often flows around justifying that. It's motivated reasoning. It's coming back, right, to fill those things in. Because being a person is a struggle. The world as it appears to each of us is not all that there is, right? My perspective, which seems so obvious and irrefutable, is a tiny corner of the universe, a tiny part of the different perspectives that are out there. Now, many people, if I can acknowledge their perspectives, don't shake me up terribly, right? They show me a little bit more of the world, a tiny bit. To really understand how they see the world, to understand perspective, can require that I have to rethink a lot of what I've taken for granted. I have to notice the veil that Iris Murdoch talks about. I have to try to pull that back. And that can make us anxious. So being a person is a struggle. It's hard. Being rational is a struggle. It's difficult. It requires challenging or being willing to let go of things that make us nervous, that are hard to make sense of. It can require admitting that we don't know. So perhaps one thing we need to say about being rational, the place to start, is to say that we all fail. We're all vulnerable. We're vulnerable to fear. We're vulnerable to hatred and the sort of comforting orientation that that can give us. We're vulnerable to getting frustrated and running out of time, so we jump to conclusions or we don't ask questions. We can be tempted to form a sort of bonded group against them, the people who think otherwise, right? So when we get together, and often you see this easily with conspiracy theorists, right? They've formed a group, it's them, and the rest of the world just doesn't understand. Of course, the people against the conspiracy theorists can do the same thing. So all of these are a threat to our rationality. All of these make it harder for us to think through and do what we have the best reasons to do. So it helps us think, I hope, about the challenges of being rational. For a human being to want to be rational, it means to know that you are always in flux. It means to know that you are vulnerable to fear, to short-sightedness, to lots of kinds of pressures that can make it harder for you to be rational. It means that you've got to practice. right? You've got to really work at it. Being rational is not something that's just going to happen because one day you decided to do it. It's a skill. You've got to build it up. I mentioned a couple of particular threats here towards the end that I do think we need to think about. One of them is hope. Generally, we think of hope as a good thing, as a helpful thing. And certainly it can be. We definitely need some degree of hope in order to go on. We need to look forward and hope that things can be better, and hope that our actions can make a difference, and hope that getting out of bed is worthwhile. All of those kinds of things we need some kind of hope for. But hope can also cause us to overrun the bounds of our reason, or to put it another way. Hope can cause us to believe that we know things will work out in a certain way when we don't. So it can be very tempting, right, when we read the news, to believe that they're making progress against COVID-19, or to believe that COVID-19 is not really that dangerous, or to believe that we finally come to the end of it, because that feels bad. That feeds our hope. When Immanuel Kant writes his book on religion, he calls for hope within the limits of reason, which I think is a wonderful way to think about it. That is, you can have hope that we will find a vaccine because it's unknown exactly how long it will take. So there's nothing wrong with that kind of hope. We can have hope that people will behave better than the evidence suggests that they might. But we don't know that that will happen, and we need to stay clear about the difference. Hope is valuable as long as you temper it with reason and what you know. Another threat, and one I think that comes up a lot, is what gets called differential caring. That is, we care about some people and what happens to them a lot more than we care about other people. The people who are closer to us, who are in our family and friends, who we are connected to, they matter a lot more to us. We do more for them. We try to take care of them more. In a way, this is a violation of reason. Those people aren't any more important to the universe than other people that I don't know and have never met. Those people's needs aren't more important to the universe than people that I don't know and have never met. So there's a tension between sort of a universal rational appreciation that everybody's interests and perspectives count, and me caring about the people who are closest to me, who are nearest to me, and taking care of those people. I don't think we have to get rid of that kind of caring, but we do have to understand 10 days it might distort our thinking, right? We find reasons to say those people aren't just more important to us, but that they're more important altogether. That the other people don't matter, not that they're just farther from us personally. So I think caring, right, about family and friends and hope are two things that are good and that go beyond reason, but that are a common threat, right, to the kind of reason and being a rational person that we need to be. We have to learn to balance those. We have to practice balancing those. Okay, so how can we do that? How can we practice balancing those? In Plato's Republic, he suggests that in order to tame your dreams, because he's afraid of the irrational part of your dreams, in order to tame those dreams, he suggests that before bed, you do some math, that you sit down and you do some geometry in particular that he has in mind, and that helps calm you down and put you in a rational mood and help organize your dreams. Now, when I first read this, I always thought this was kind of nonsense. It struck me as ancient superstition that had made its way into this book. But there might be something to it. Recently, they have discovered when people experience a traumatic incident, if they go to sleep within 6 hours, they're much more likely to develop PTSD than if they stay up for more than 6 hours. Because what happens when you dream is you consolidate your memories. Your brain goes through and it filters out what it's not going to keep, and it highlights and strengthens what it is going to keep. So if you're still agitated from a traumatic event, if it's still winding you up when you go to sleep, it gets written into you, right, in a way that gets very hard to get rid of. So maybe Plato had a point. That doing math before bed helps, because when you do math, you follow the reasons. You don't really care about the outcome, right? You're not rooting for number 2 or favoring hoping that the result will be 3. You're just thinking about the problem and the reasons. You're practicing. You're disciplining yourself. You're helping to make yourself just that little bit more rational and meet those sorts of challenges. So that's one example that that I like to consider. But I would like us to talk about other ways that we have difficulty, that we struggle with being rational, and things we might do to help train ourselves to become more rational.